thing I want to talk about sort of tonight is something that we, sort of an issue that we had before we joined Cloudflare. Cloudflare acquired our startup, Link, and Link was a hosting sort of platform for front-end applications. And basically, we did everything from building your front end to deploying it, and like building and deploying it. And one of the things we wanted to do for a while was streaming build logs. So while we were building things, like if you were in the sort of UI and you were looking at it, we wanted to sort of stream the build logs to you. Now, this is an application that was built fully on sort of almost entirely on Lambdas and sort of serverless. So what we're going to talk about is sort of a quick, high-level, slightly simplified sort of overview of what it was. Then sort of what we would have to build if we were going to do this based on sort of Lambdas and API gateway and some of the other sort of AWS infrastructure, which will hopefully make it clear why we never did this, because it was just too much work. And then durable objects were released sort of at that time, and that was like a perfect solution for this particular use case. So then we're going to sort of talk about like what that looked like, and then we're going to dive into sort of what that solution looked like. Feel free to ask any questions during the presentation. It isn't very long, and I did that on purpose so that we had lots of time to sort of ask questions and sort of talk about this sort of as we go along. Yeah, so if you could sort of jump in at any time with any questions that you might have. So let's get that sharing going again. So this is basically a high-level overview of like the parts of the application that are relevant for us sort of today. So basically, you would commit something to GitHub, which would be pushed to our sort of webhook API gateway, and that was sent to a webhook Lambda. That would sort of process it. It would sort of do some lookups in a DynamoDB table, and then sort of tell the build cluster to start a build. Now, that container would sort of was sort of the only bit that was an actual container running in a sort of a virtual private sort of subnet, and that container would update a DynamoDB table, and that would be sort of queryable from a sort of user interface. So this is sort of how we were doing this, and it still worked. Like we're doing sort of the occasional every 10 seconds or so, we update the DynamoDB table, which is sort of pushed out to the sort of client, and it works, but it's a bit sort of clunky. But yeah, we have been sort of looking at how to improve this sort of while, but this is sort of what we would have to do. And we would sort of have to create like a new API gateway for our clients, a new API gateway for the builder. Like the builder would need to be in a separate sort of VPC that wasn't sort of exposed to sort of the internet, and then we'd have to have a Lambda on the web services on the builder side, one on the client side. They both need to sort of talk to DynamoDB, and sort of every update you sort of trigger 2 or 3 of these sort of invocations, so that you can sort of push this to your customer. And like setting up all this infrastructure to go from updates every couple seconds to, like, as soon as they sort of come in, just wasn't worth the effort, right? We just couldn't justify spending our sort of startup money on this, even though we knew it would actually be a pretty good sort of UI update. And this is sort of what the end result sort of became, where when durable objects sort of were released, like, we had like a worker, a Cloudflare worker, that both the build container and any client could connect to, and that durable object would take the would sort of like listen to the build events sort of as they came in, and would sort of forward things over the other WebSocket connections out to sort of all clients. And as you'll see, like, this is tens of lines of code at most, and only like a very simplified sort of solution. Now, people sort of occasionally sort of, like, it's hard to get your head around what a durable object is. So you have sort of, on the one hand, you have Cloudflare Workers. Like, in Cloudflare Workers are pretty straightforward. They are Cloudflare Workers, like every HTTP request coming in that's bound for a worker spins up this sort of V8, this sort of JavaScript engine, and you can run any sort of code that sort of responds, passes on to sort of origins. But basically, you have this sort of JavaScript that you can run on every HTTP request. So that's sort of like this simple, relatively straightforward thing. But then durable objects come along, and it's just like a very different sort of model. The one change that's such a very big change with durable objects is there can only be one durable object for any given identifier, sort of worldwide. And sort of like the Workers platform will make sure that if you go, I have an identifier here, please connect to it, that there's only ever one of those objects alive at the same time. And also with that sort of object comes sort of storage attached that you can use, which is sort of fully transactional, right? So it's an entirely different model to think about, and it's kind of hard to sort of get your head around. So yeah, let's sort of dive into like a little deeper as to sort of what that translates to. So the first thing we do is the connection step. And sort of both the build container and the sort of clients have slightly different URLs. The server connects to, this is like the site name, the project name, server, and then a commit hash. And the client connects to the same, except sort of like the client. So if everything goes right, I should be able to zoom in. Yes, thank you, Myro. So in this sort of worker, this is what we're talking to now, is this worker. So this is the thing that runs in every data center. And it's sort of massively scalable. And in here, we want to do things like parse the request so that we know which project we're talking about, whether it's whether sort of what hash we are talking about, right? Then we do authy things. In our case, we're looking at a JWT token from the client and a sort of an API token for the build server, and to check whether those are valid. And once that's out of the way, here's sort of like the only bit of sort of magic is here, which is what we're doing in here is saying to the platform, like the environment is a configuration object, and in there we go. Like, so this durable object namespace that we have configured, what I want to do is give me an identifier sort of from this name, and then we put in the commit SHA. Or in our case, we actually used the tree ID, but it doesn't really matter. So we have this sort of like unique identifier that we then translate into an sort of an ID. And once we sort of, the platform then figures out, like, does this ID, does this sort of name exist anywhere in the world already? And if yes, we'll connect you, we'll grab that identifier and connect you to that particular durable object. And if not, we'll create one and give you the identifier for that one. And like once we have the identifier, we can sort of connect to it, and we now get a stub. And this is like the client side object that we're talking to. And we call fetch on it, which is just like a similar thing to like the fetch method that you're sort of know and maybe love. So yeah, we can just put in the exact requests that we have been sort of passed in, and we sent that HTTP request to the durable object. It doesn't actually use HTTP as far as I know, but for all intents and purposes, that doesn't really, you don't need to know that. Right. So what we then do is, once we sort of get into the durable object, we implement another fetch method. And again, you want to parse the URL to get some of the information out of that sort of URL. But what we do here is create a new WebSocket pair. And WebSocket pair is sort of like a Cloudflare specific sort of interface to think about WebSockets. And what we do with a WebSocket pair is like we keep one, like it's basically the two ends. It represents the two ends of a WebSocket connection. So what we do here is we hold on to what I call our WS, like our WebSocket sort of end. And later here, you'll see that we pass the other to the client so that the client can has all the information. What we then need to do is like call accept on our end of the WebSocket connection. And that basically means tells the runtime that we'll be handling the WebSocket connection. Like we're not forwarding it to anyone else. So yeah, once that's done, we check whether this sort of connection request is for the server or the client. And if this is a server request, we basically sort of save that, right? Like our WS, we save that as sort of like the server. And then we add event listeners. Like what do we do when a message arrives, and what do we do when like the server closes the stream, right? And if it's a client, what we do now, and this is the interesting bit, we stream out everything we have already received as a durable object. Because one of the challenges when you're talking about streaming build logs is that it seems a pretty trivial use case, but once you sort of get into it, it gets kind of tricky pretty quickly. Because if you sort of like a build takes a couple of minutes maybe, and the client might connect after, or is likely to connect even after the build has started. So there is already something that we have to sort of keep track of. And sort of, yeah, like doing that in like a fully stateless thing like a Lambda is really hard to do, because you'd have to store that information somewhere, which is, again, you're pretty quickly sort of reaching for DynamoDB to sort of store that in, because you need to send that to clients that sort of connect for the first time. And the other thing is, it's not a one-to-one connection, because you can have multiple people watch the same build. So those two makes it sort of like really sort of interesting, and when you're building out this type of feature. So yeah, like when a client connects, you'll later see sort of this.logs is the logs that we have received so far. Yeah, and this is this is all saved in memory. Right? We could save this in a sort of durable storage, but in our particular use case, we never bothered, because it was only a streaming build log. It didn't need to be. I just noticed a bug that is this.log in the constructor and this.logs here, for other people who wanted to point that out. But yeah, it should be the same. And what we then do in this sort of like the this.clients.push is we save our end of the WebSocket connection to all our clients, right? And we save those sort of in an array. And then what we do is return a new response, which is basically a response to the upgrade sort of request to the WebSocket, and we pass in sort of the WebSocket and that sort of client WebSocket end. And what we now have is a durable object that has a build server connected to it for one build. And it has all the clients, which may be none, that are interested in watching this build. So that's great. So, and then it's literally super simple after that. Whenever the build server has information, it will send the message over a regular WebSocket connection, and it will arrive in the durable object, and we just sort of get the event, which has a data sort of attribute, which is just a string of data. So we push that up into the log, and then we tell each of our clients about this new piece of data. And that automatically updates no clients, 1, 2, 25 clients that are listening to this particular update. And then at the end, sort of when the server closes, what we do is we take this build log, sort of turn it into like one big string, and we just send that out, and we save that in KV, which is the key value store that sort of Cloudflare has. We could have saved this in, like just kept it in the durable object, but then sort of querying becomes sort of a bit sort of convoluted is the word I'm looking for, because you'd have to find that same durable object every single time you want to sort of query it. And now if we want to build like an API on top of it, we basically do the same thing, but in reverse. We go build log.get, we generate the same key, and now we just get that build log bag in our sort of workers, right? And this is all there is to it. So what that means is we will have one durable object per build. That's and one of those durable objects will be sort of in memory and running and accepting connections as we're building things. And so that's one of those things that durable objects are sort of really good at in contrast to workers or lambdas or any sort of like the sort of stateless sort of functions, is that it's really good to coordinate things. Maybe you have a workflow that you want to sort of track. That can be really simply sort of modeled as a durable object, because you'll be talking to the same object with the same storage sort of every single time. Sort of chats, collaborative editing, those are all sort of use cases that are really hard to build sort of stateless. But yeah, having something like a durable object where you can have state, you can have logic, and you can have persistence all in one function is a great use case that is going to unlock a lot of use cases that we haven't been able to solve very well in this sort of stateless worker type scenario. So yeah, like that was like the part of that sort of presentation. And yeah, the one thing I love, one of the best things I love about this is that it's so easy that it almost doesn't feel sort of worthwhile talking about, right? Like I was making the sort of content for the presentation and going like, like, should I make a more like complex example? And I go like, no, this is a real use case that solved the real problem, and it can be done with, like I said, tens of lines of code, and you're done. And that's what's so beautiful